Welcome to this week's edition of Journalists Roundtable. I'm Francine Schertzer. Our guests this week are Bruce Siwy, Pennsylvania State Bureau reporter for the USA Today Network; Hallie Lauer, she serves as City Hall reporter for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette; and Ben Wasserstein, he is the Capitol Bureau Chief with WITF in Harrisburg. Ben, we'll start with you. You read about President Biden's efforts to reach out to the African-American voters. Can you talk a little bit about why this constituency is so important to the presidential race?
Well, in the last two presidential races, Pennsylvania was won by less than 90,000 votes. So getting everybody out there is very important. And according to some New York Times polls after 2020, many black voters voted for Democrats. So trying to get as many black voters out and getting as many minority groups out to vote for the Democrats is a key point that the Biden campaign is trying to address and trying to win the state of Pennsylvania with.
What accomplishments are the Biden campaign really touting to this constituency?
Well, they're touting one thing is the reschedulization of marijuana, and as well as lowering the unemployment rate for black individuals.
Are there other demographics? I'd like to open it up to the two of you as well. Are there other demographics that are really being seeked out as being important to this particular race?
Well, I would say independents. I think that that's a voter group that in Pennsylvania typically has been a nice bellwether for how things are going to go here. We have a swing state here, a purple state, and I think that those middle ground voters often represent the difference. And I think that both campaigns would do well to pay very close attention to what the issues are for that group and to appeal to that group. In this particular case, you have two very, very much known commodities in Joe Biden and Donald Trump. People know where they stand. People know what they would bring to the table, having both with a full term underneath them. And so I think identifying their concerns and appealing to their concerns is going to be really important because, of course, on both sides, blue and red, the hardcore of those camps are already dug in. So I think that the independents are one that they'll want to reach out to and pay attention to.
Yeah, and I think additionally, too, both parties are looking really closely at the youth vote, those college-age students that are freshly registered to vote and are really making their opinions known, particularly on the Gaza conflict, with all of these college protests. And so the Biden campaign specifically, after you had all of those non-committed votes in the primary, is really going to have to make up some ground with them, I feel like.
Ben, you had an opportunity to speak with younger voters at Millersville University earlier this spring. What issues did they voice were most important to them?
Well, one of the issues that I found interesting that they were discussing was that just justices and judges in general. Trump appointed a ton of judges in the hundreds. I don't quite know the exact number, as well as 3 Supreme Court justices. And they have been having there's been a few decisions over the past couple weeks that have been decided based on the conservative majority of the court. So one of the things that they're concerned about is how that can shape the future of America and how that can shape their future. Because with decisions like the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, that caused a lot of unease with some of the female students that I was talking about and what that means for their future.
Now, you had also in that article written that younger voters would like some of the candidates to reach out to them on different platforms than have traditionally been used. Can you talk a little bit about that? And perhaps are there candidates that are being more successful using other platforms like Twitter or TikTok?
Well, with Twitter, it's a little bit iffy just because Trump doesn't use Twitter anymore. He uses Truth Social, and Biden is using Twitter, but is using it in more of a traditional politician sense. Both of them have recently joined TikTok, although Trump joining TikTok comes at an unusual time when his party has been trying to block TikTok due to their ties with the Chinese government. So it's a very interesting situation, and whether or not that ends up working at the ground level is yet to be seen.
Bruce, I'd like to look at something that you've written about. It's been 1 week since President Donald Trump was convicted of 34 felony charges. What impact do you see this having on the presidential race?
Frankly, I'm not sure that it's going to have a huge impact, although when you're talking about very slim margins, certainly it wouldn't take much to sway this race one way or another. A lot of the voters that I spoke to and that other colleagues had spoken to really felt dug in and entrenched on the presidential race already before the outcome of this race. I think people have a pretty good sense of who Donald Trump is, what he represents, and what he may or may not do in office. And so I'm just not all that sure, based on the interviews that I conducted, that it's going to have a huge impact. But again, I think that comes with the caveat of when you're talking about races decided by, maybe 80,000 votes or less in this state, it really doesn't take a whole lot to sway things one way or another. And so, again, the voters I talked to pretty much had their opinions set in stone before and after the verdict. Didn't really move them a whole lot. And I think that watching those polls and seeing sort of what people are responding to as time moves on is going to be really interesting as we approach November.
How are elected officials reacting to this verdict?
Largely partisan lines, as you might expect. When you peruse social media or check your inbox as a journalist, you're seeing the public statements that come out in the minutes or hours or days after something like this on the political scale. And yes, again, you're seeing a lot of very partisan line responses. A lot of Democrats, basically saying that no one is above the law. A lot of Republicans echoing the idea that this is a witch hunt. And then, in some cases, a little bit of silence, which is interesting, and maybe for political reasons. I know that in looking at, for example, Dave McCormick running for U.S. Senate was, of course, out in the forefront, very vocally opposed to the verdict and decrying the result of that. His opponent, the incumbent Senator Bob Casey, however, there was no immediate statement from his office, so sort of staying out of the fray on that one. So sort of interesting to see also how a decision like this and how the presidential race is going to shake up and impact other down ballot races across the Commonwealth.
Ben, your thoughts on how this verdict might affect the election?
Well, it's a little bit too early to tell. It will take a few weeks, and polls can be incorrect, as we saw in 2016 when it was predicted that Hillary was going to win. So it's going to take a little time. I had the time to talk with Burward Yost from Franklin Marshall College the other week, and he was telling me that we really don't know, and we can't tell as of right now if this is going to have an effect. And the news of this whole hush money payments came out, I believe it was in the interim between after Trump won and before he was inaugurated. So it's been out for around 8 years now. So whether it has an impact still remains to be seen, although now that it's verdict and it's official, there's not really a way of saying that this didn't happen.
Bruce, a moment ago you talked about independent voters being an interesting and important constituency in this election. What role do you think third-party candidates might have in the presidential race?
Well, again, we're talking in Pennsylvania and some of these other swing states at very, very small margins. And so I think having some of these candidates on the ballot, I think most notably Robert Kennedy Jr., who seems to be polling better than some of the others who are being talked about, I think that they could have an impact on this. And I think the most interesting part of that question is, in what way will they impact it? I think Robert Kennedy has name recognition that legacy Democrats are going to identify with and, may feel that they want to move in his direction. But then again, he personally seems to, use a lot of talking points that you'd hear more from Republicans when you talk about some issues across the board. He seems to sound more like Trump than Biden in some ways. And so I think they will have an impact. And I do think that, we would do well to pay attention as to how the petition chasing is going in these swing states, including Pennsylvania. His campaign has been very much out front about where he's on the ballot, where they're getting the signatures and where they still need the signatures. And I'm not hearing a whole lot about Pennsylvania yet, but certainly going to be paying attention to that as we move forward to see whether or not he's able to make the ballot here, because he could make a difference.
One other voter bloc I'd like to talk about briefly is the progressive pro-Palestine Democrats. Some of them had cast a protest vote, basically, in the primary. Any anticipation of where their vote will go in November?
I think at this time, that's the $1 million question, because, you do have a significant protest vote. You do have some significant unrest in the parties, I guess more progressive or left wing. And I think that his campaign, Biden's campaign, is going to have to do some work to try to pull those folks back into his camp. I do think that right now that would be a concern of his. He certainly doesn't have a lot of wiggle room in Pennsylvania and some of these other swing states. And so it's going to be quite the balancing act, I think, to maybe not alienate some moderates that voted for him or some independents who voted for him in 2020 that elevated him to victory. He's going to have to certainly pay attention to them, but also, what is he going to do to make sure that those on the left don't feel that they're left out of this conversation, or don't feel that they're not being represented in the White House in some way. I think that that's a really, really tough and difficult challenge for him and his campaign moving forward.
I'd like to shift our focus now to the state treasurer race. Hallie, you've been writing about this quite a bit. You note that 3 Democratic county officials filed complaints with the FEC claiming that Democratic nominee for Treasurer Erin McClelland had a disregard for campaign finance laws. What specifically are they charging that she has done incorrectly?
Yeah, so those 3 Democrats that filed that complaint with the FEC, it actually relates back to a 2 previous congressional races that Erin McClelland ran for. I want to say 2014, 2016, that time frame. And this gets in the weeds a little bit, but she never terminated her campaign committee. And so because of that, you're required to continue to file campaign finance reports. And she did that for a number of years. And then in 2020, she missed a few deadlines. The FEC had sent her some administrative letters reminding her, hey, you have to file these. She filed them late in April and July of 2020, and then just quit filing altogether until last year when the FEC terminated the committee for inactivity. And so they filed a complaint regarding those missing, I think, 11 or 12 finance reports because there was still money in her committee account and there were debts still owed. So they're alleging that, voters don't know what happened to that money or if those debts were paid.
Is the Attorney General likely to take up this case?
It doesn't seem so. I spoke to them previously and they said that they've looked into the situation, but a criminal complaint won't be filed.
And has the McClelland campaign issued any response?
Not to me and not that I've seen on any public statements.
You had also previously written that the McClelland campaign's communications director also works as a reporter. Is that a conflict of interest?
Professionals seem to think so. I reached out to, people from Poynter, people from the Society of Professional Journalists, a communications professor from St. Bonaventure in New York, and they all seem to think that, if you are running somebody's campaign, you should not be a journalist, particularly a journalist that covers politics, even if it's not that specific race. A number of people really do think that that is a conflict of interest.
Let's move on to another topic now. Bruce, you've been writing about U.S. Senator John Fetterman. You had noted that his unwavering support for Israel in their war with Hamas. How's that support impacting how Fetterman is being perceived politically?
He's definitely a lightning rod. And I think that he's also someone who's really gone out of his way to be very vocal on positions that maybe other politicians would really kind of stay away from, that they could be controversial, they could potentially be politically damaging. And I don't know. I think that it's another situation where probably the progressive base within his party is now starting to really have some reservations about him. Our Revolution, which is a sort of a nonprofit type advocacy group that supported him as a progressive candidate in 2022, they've very publicly sort of backed away from him at this point. So I think he's alienated some on that side of his base. But again, just the delicate balance of PA is so fascinating. You have a situation now where in many ways he's perhaps alienated some progressives, but in a general election in Pennsylvania, maybe in some ways he's said or done things that have made conservatives or moderates feel better about him. So definitely an interesting dynamic. And one other note, some polling that I saw recently along those lines, this doesn't necessarily speak to his popularity, but it does speak to his name recognition. People had more information and more of an opinion on John Fetterman than Bob Casey. And of course, Bob Casey's been around forever and is a legacy name, someone who's held state row offices and everything else. And yet John Fetterman has already sort of surpassed him in terms of name recognition and public opinion one way or another. So I thought that was sort of interesting and just maybe speaks also to the personalities of our 2 Democratic but very different personality-wise senators.
I also want to point out that with Fetterman's campaign, he was running against a television personality, which definitely boosted his visibility among the American public. And this was 2022, so this was after the 2020 election, which we all know how that one went and the responses to that. So it was really testing the waters to see how 2024 would go and how the country would shift towards a more right-wing agenda.
How is Senator Fetterman reacting to characterizations previously of him being a progressive, and has he been consistent with how he defines himself?
Yeah, that's been a point of contention. He is in some ways really embraced on the campaign trail and in the past some aspects of that progressive label, allying himself with Bernie Sanders and on some other positions. And so, again, I think that just speaks to really something that he's had to walk a fine line on. Again, he talked on certain areas about being a progressive during the campaign, and now getting some heat for his position on Israel. Although in his defense, he has been very vocally pro-Israel in many capacities. When you look at the Tree of Life shooting that unfortunately transpired in the Pittsburgh area, and you go back to that, he has been visible there. He has been vocally supporting that community. And in fact, at one point during, I believe it was his lieutenant governor race, sort of offered to suspend his campaign amid all of that. And that really, I think, was viewed as an olive branch across the aisle during that race. And so, yeah, it's it's been interesting. He's definitely, I think, in some ways, sort of flip-flopped on some things or changed, public perception of him. But he's not really shying away from it either. He's sort of embracing it and sort of, again, being very upfront about it. So again, I think it's going to be interesting to see what the response to him is when he comes up for re-election. Although, in fairness, he does have several years before that takes place.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, in Allegheny County here, there are a couple progressive groups that have already decided that they're going to be cutting ties with him when his election does come up because of his pro-Israel stance. So it'll be interesting to see if that continues or how that unfolds in the years.
Do you think that's a sign of further division within the Democratic Party itself?
I'm not so sure. I think it might be too early to tell for that, at least in the Allegheny County area. I can't really speak for more of Pennsylvania than that, but there's a growing number of progressive groups here and a progressive, I guess you could call it wave. We elected the first Black mayor a couple years ago. We just elected the first female county executive, who both were backed by a large number of progressive voters. So I don't necessarily know that it points to a divide. Maybe a growing number of people are identifying as progressive, but I think it's a little early to tell.
Pennsylvania has the only divided legislature in the country. Bruce, you had written about the 4 different legislative caucuses and how they're targeting specific seats. Can you just talk briefly about what areas of the state look like they may be vulnerable and up for grabs this year?
Yeah, I mean, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, we still have this budget to deal with. But yeah, I am intrigued by this whole question because we could be looking at a very different reality in Harrisburg a year from now politically. And so when I talk to some insiders on both sides of the aisle about what to expect in terms of the races to watch and the campaigns that are really going to be consequential this year, for Democrats to take control of the legislature and to really help Josh Shapiro as governor enact his agenda, they need to keep the House, of course, where they have a narrow majority, but they also need to flip the Senate, and that would require essentially a net gain of 3. And 3 of the areas that they're really looking at is District 49, Republican Senator Dan Laughlin versus Jim Wirtz. Laughlin, in that area of the state up near Erie, he's done pretty well for himself, really, in a district that's sort of blue in some ways. He won by 6 points 8 years ago and 4 years ago by 20 points during a presidential year. So he certainly likes his chances of re-election, but Democrats obviously feel that there's an opportunity there. There's also District 37. That is Senator Devlin Robinson's seat. This is a district that went 52% for John Fetterman in 2022. So again, another place where Democrats see an opportunity. And beyond that, you have District 15, where the Democratic nominee for that seat is State Rep Patty Kim, who has name recognition and is someone that they really see as a great, strong candidate to try to flip that seat. So there are 3 areas in which the Democrats could make gains, and if they hold the House, essentially take control of the legislature.
Are there specific issues or votes that can make a seat vulnerable, or do you think it lends to more broader political trends?
Yeah, I think the composition of the voter base makes a difference in some cases. Also, politics, as they say, is local. And sometimes it does come down to whether or not there's an issue locally that really resonates with voters there. Even things like turnout can make a difference in these races. When you look at some of these seats that are in off years, there's maybe not a great or strong turnout, and people don't really invest too much time into looking at candidates. I think presidential years amplify the stakes in some ways. And I think they obviously draw turnout and in some ways maybe draw some, additional interest. And so I am going to be fascinated to see how that really projects across the state. And just to quickly touch on the House as well, that's another area where we could see major change this year. If things go the other way, if Republicans hold the Senate and manage to flip the House, which really they only needed a net gain of one, Governor Shapiro at that point is dealing with a red legislature in which things could look radically different in terms of what makes it to his desk and what sort of agenda he can put in there. So there's a couple races to watch there as well. Rob Matzey's seat in the 16th district, Frank Burns in the 72nd, and in the 144th, Brian Monroe on the east side of the state. I think those are three races in the House to keep an eye on because, again, Republicans are going to be hungry to get that chamber back. And if they do, again, I think we see a very different reality in the budgeting process and everything else that comes out of the Capitol in Harrisburg moving forward.
Hallie, you'd written that women lag behind in getting elected to public office in Pennsylvania compared to other states. What do you think are the issues that really make it more difficult for women to seek these and win these seats?
One of the main issues that women face is that there isn't a lot of support for them from the parties specifically. And that is getting better in recent years. But a lot of the issues they face is that they don't have the same support system. So, men tend to ask other men to run and tend to support them financially. Rutgers did a really great study that shows that female donors, so women who are donating to campaigns, lag tremendously behind men who are donating to campaigns. And so that structured support, like from the parties themselves, is one of the reasons they struggle. But then, there's just not a lot of other supports in place either. So women tend to wait longer to run for office so that they are not caring for their children. They wait till their children are out of the home so that they have the time. It just recently, I believe, passed federally that women and men can now use their campaign funds for childcare. And so because of something like that, we might be able to see a lot more women, running for office. But it's things like that, the childcare, the support from the parties that really tend to hold a lot of women back.
So as we are having a discussion in early June, the end of the month is the state budget deadline. One of the issues that had been of disagreement last year was school vouchers. The Lifeline Scholarships Bill has recently, I believe mid last month, moved through the Senate Education Committee. Can you talk a little bit about the vouchers issue and the likelihood of it to appear in this year's budget negotiations?
Well, the vouchers are likely to appear in this year's negotiations. Last year, Shapiro initially supported it and then put a line item veto to prevent a long impasse. That didn't really work as the budget was finalized on December 18th, on the last day of session that they could possibly have. So it's going to be an issue because we see that the Commonwealth Court had ruled that Pennsylvania's system of funding public schools is unconstitutional, and the legislature is required to fix that situation. So some of the counterproposal, vouchers are really a counterproposal to trying to having parents get more choice and saying where they want their kids to go to school. So it's going to really come down to how Pennsylvania lawmakers want to see the future of education in this state.
Ben, you'd also written about the formation of a new LGBTQ plus advocacy group, Fairness Pennsylvania. Could you just talk briefly about who they are and what their specific goals are? Well,
they launched this week, and one of their main goals is passing the Fairness Act, which passed the House over a year ago. It's currently in the Senate State Government Committee. I have no idea if it's going to be moving out. That is headed by Senator Chris Dush. I have not heard a response from him as to whether or not it will be moving. But they're looking to try to codify some rules in the Human Relations Act, preventing discrimination based on things such as sexual orientation or sexual, like how expression, stuff like that. So they want to protect the LGBTQ plus community, make it easier to have their names changed, stuff like that, protect trans girls in sports. So they're going to have it. This is the first full-time lobbying group devoted solely to LGBTQ plus community and their issues, and we'll see how they work and how they get things accomplished.
And just briefly before we run out of time, Hallie, you had written about the memorial for former Allegheny County Chief Executive Jim Roddy. For those that aren't familiar, can you just talk briefly about who he was and his contributions to Pennsylvania?
Yeah, Jim Roddy was the first county executive in Allegheny County. He was elected in 1999 after they moved away from a 3-commissioner government. And he's actually since then been the only Republican ever elected to that office. And he, from hearing all of the stories from everyone, was really good at bringing everyone together from both sides of the aisle. And that was evident even in his memorial service. Republicans and Democrats came to talk about what an outstanding human this was and what he really did to help, shape the Allegheny County government as we know it today.
I'd like to thank my guests. They've been Hallie Lauer, City Hall reporter for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Bruce Siwy, Pennsylvania State Capitol Bureau reporter for the USA Today Network, and Ben Wasserstein of the Capitol Bureau Chief for WITF in Harrisburg. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.